Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Moby Dick Book Club. As always, you are welcome to join the Discord server. The link to which can be found beneath us. But just to let you guys know, I did do the reading and I did take my notes as I usually do on each chapter, but I forgot to bring them. So when I give my little chapter summaries, if there's a salient detail you think I missed, feel free to chime in and add into it. But we're going to start with chapter 49. Picks up right after Starbuck's boat, along with Ishmael, gets picked up by the Pequod. And he starts off with his ruminations about, when you're kind of near death, you tend to treat life like it's a giant joke, that sort of thing. And then he asks the more experienced whalers, is this kind of crazy lowering and going after a whale during a squall a normal sort of thing? And everybody's like, yeah, that's just kind of what life is like. And so he concludes that all of these whalers are crazy and then decides to update his will. Um, Not sure who he's willing his things towards, and not sure what the legality of having your will witnessed by a barbarian, savage cannibal is, but apparently that's an important thing for Ishmael here. So a rather short chapter and a rather humorous chapter, but I enjoyed reading it. Are you still standing by your theory that the whole capsizing the boat in the squall thing was just made up, Mark?
Uh, no, I mean, I don't. It's hard to tell what's made up with this guy. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, I actually can't imagine a scenario where seeing a squall, you would take a whaling boat out in it. I've seen these whaling boats, and I mean, they're great. They're good for what they're good for, but nasty weather is not one of them. And unless you've been sailing and gotten caught in a squall, both of those things, you probably don't appreciate exactly what that's like. But I can tell you, even with sails down, it's not pleasant. And on the ocean, I can't imagine. I can't even imagine what an ocean squall would do to you. Even on the Atlantic's relatively calm. On the Pacific, nah. In a little boat like that, you're all done. You're cooked. In the middle of the Atlantic, a little boat like you're cooked. I'm not, I don't, when you say squall, what do you mean? Because an actual storm squall would swamp that boat in about 4 seconds and that'd be the end of you. They wouldn't, that's the other thing about a squall. Like, the squall comes over you, no one's coming to get you. You're not going to be visible to anything. Squalls, I mean, darkness comes. And I mean, I've been in short squalls too. I've been in more than one. Really quick ones, even like 4 or 5 minute ones. You'd be surprised how displaced you are from where you were on a lake, even or in a river or something. It's remarkable how quickly things move. And so when that darkness comes, because squalls are very dark, um, yeah, you're not going to be able to keep track of things. So again, what do you mean by squall? Because I've got my doubts. A squall on the ocean, you would not sail a boat like that into it anyway. You wouldn't row one into it. Nah, not because squalls too dump a lot of water, and these are open boats. So I mean, the large boat's not an open boat, so that's good. You can close the top, all the water comes up. The whaling boats are open boats. There's not much you can do about that because you're in it, unless you turn it into a submarine or something. It's not going to work. So I don't, I'm just skeptical as to what squall means at this point because something happened. But I can't imagine it's normal to go into a quote squall. I mean, these are very thin boats because they're designed to be very fast. So they don't break apart while the whale's pulling them at a ridiculous speed, like a rowboat would just disintegrate almost instantly. Um, so yeah, and they're not designed for boats. If you design boats, I know somebody who designed his own boat. When you start actually working on boat designs, there's all these trade-offs you have to make. between draw, which is how into the water you poke, right? And speed, which is related but not entirely, right? Because it's more about how much surface area you have. And you can have a lot of surface area down without having a lot of total surface area. There's there's trade-offs there, right? Yeah, I'm not seeing it. Right, versus resiliency in storms. The big boats are resilient in storms. That's why they're not open boats, right? Because if they were open, you can't be resilient in a storm. Sorry, like
Unless you had pumps just running constantly.
that won't work. No, you got to remember on the ocean, even in the Atlantic, when you get into the tropics, you can get 4 to 8 inches an hour of rain. There aren't pumps for that. Sorry, and boats are small, so like when you get that much rain in that small an area, pumps are worthless.
I particularly liked that the Ishmael goes like kind of inquiring after this supposed squall, and he asks Starbuck, who's supposed to be like the most prudent of everybody on the ship. I suppose that going plump on a flying whale with your sails set in a foggy squall is the height of a whaleman's discretion. He says, "Certain, I've lowered for whales from a leaking ship in a gale off Cape Horn." It's like I don't know, it's like. But we start to get into these like future chapters, and the claims that other people make become even more absurd. That you start to wonder, it starts to get a little much. It's very entertaining, but I don't know.
These whalemen
Yeah.
could just be crazy.
Could be. Yeah, no, the gale off Cape Horn is not even remotely possible. Like we're not dealing with the possible anymore. We're well out of the range. The problem with the Cape Horn is the following. So this is the bottom end of Chile, right? It's actually really the narrow strait between Antarctica and we'll call it civilized land where humans can kind of live. And I might have my numbers incorrect, but actually I think this is going to sound really hard to believe. The ocean is something like 12 feet higher in the Pacific than it is in the Atlantic, and they're connected. So the points at which they connect are
very
rather
turbulent,
tumultuous.
And would that vary with the tides too? You got to time it with the tides as well.
No, what the tides do is the tides change the size of the swells or the waves. Right, swells and waves are slightly different, but waves are the result of depth, and swells are the result of movement. So as swells get closer to land, they turn into waves effectively. It's a little weird. There's a little bit of not crossover and a little bit of crossover. But yeah, the pull of the moon affects all that. So I'm sure, like right now, I think at least I'm not in South Carolina, but I'm told in South Carolina right now it's king tides, which are the high tides, and that's pull of the moon stuff. And so what that means in a place like Charleston, South Carolina is, it's just flooding all the time for real. Like, because it's once a year, it floods during the king tides in a bunch of Charleston, right? And a bunch of other coastal cities. This is true. Like king tides, and you're almost kind of underwater. And when that water gets lifted up, you're all done. That's the end of it. And then it goes back to normal, and it doesn't last long enough to do that much harm, so people just deal with it. And there's plenty of cities that have this problem. Boston has this problem on a regular basis, right? Especially if they have rains during spring tides or king tides, they're pretty much screwed. There's just areas of the cities that flood, and they just flooded.
No basements.
I mean, yeah, the basements are wet for a while. That's there's in fact, this happened. I think it was earlier this year. They lost like 1 or 2 T stations because that happens, and they just shut it down, and they use buses, and they bus around the big lakes of water in the middle of the road, and not every year is that bad. It's one of those things, but yeah, we kind of take these things for granted. But like at Cape Horn, basically you need a large ship. You're not putting whaling vessels anywhere near that. It's not happening. And if you haven't seen a 20-foot swell on the ocean, and I've been in them, it's in a very small boat that wasn't 20 feet, by the way. You just can't imagine how terrifying it is. Like,
You're on a roller coaster under those circumstances.
we were in a 15-foot Boston whaler. I was there with my uncle, and we were going from Hills Beach, Maine, up to Fort George's Island in the middle of Casco Bay, Portland, basically. Which, by the way, if you haven't been in the island in Fort George's or some island in the Casco Bay, you haven't lived yet. That's for
I've
sure.
been to Naples.
And I think the Casco Bay has more islands than any other bay in the world. And it's quite the place. But to get there, you've got to go around, I think it's Cape Ann, something like that. But you have to go like way out into the ocean, or at least near the ocean, and then back in on the other side of it, on the other side of that particular outcropping. And it's a lot. Cape Ann's huge. It's huge. It's enormous. And there's islands all up and down, like the whole way there's islands. Yeah, we were going fast. We had just one outboard motor, and we were going fast enough, the two of us, that we were hitting a swell and leaping over a swell and coming down on the next swell, which was coming at us, and we were coming down at it like that with the edge of the boat. And I thought the boat was going to splinter into a billion pieces. And my uncle was like, "Nah, it'll be fine." And he was right, but it didn't feel that way because, and had we stopped, I mean, normally even a small 15-foot Boston whaler, well, it's a rowboat effectively, so you can row it. But because it's made out of a single piece of special fiberglass, it's super resilient to the water. And that's another thing that's going to come up. Wooden boats or any boats made out of pieces leak, period. End of statement. Fiberglass boats, if they're in the water long enough, will also leak, but through infiltrations. It's not enough of a leak to worry about. But until you get to substance where you can do a single surface, you could dip a boat, at least in theory. I don't know if that's been done, but you could dip a boat. That would work. But like basically, if you make it out of parts, it's going to leak.
Mhm.
But with this boat, because it was basically a rowboat shape, and you can row it. I mean, it had oarlocks and we had oars. So in theory, we wouldn't have been totally out of luck. Although I don't know how long it would take us to row back to shore that I couldn't see. And that was not due to not being up high enough. Let me put it that way, because we were hitting swells and going way up in the air. That boat will not drown in swells. It'll be fine because there's enough space between the swells. I mean, you'll be seasick for sure. You'll get massively ill. But if you have a storm, oh yeah, bang, I give it 5, maybe 10 minutes tops. Like you're done. An open boat. There's no way, because even if you don't get swamped by the swell, which gets very likely in the storm because the swells just get really high, the spray, because swells are constantly crashing into one another and creating spray on their own, even without rain, just the spray will swamp your boat over, a very short amount of time, faster than you can bail it. Let me put it that way.
Well, if only we had a whaler to tell us about that, but they're all dead.
They're all dead. Thank goodness.
And the whales are surviving. So we got a bunch of little short chapters.
I liked a little bit about the will that he says that, it seems strange that like the guys at sea would be doing their wills, but it's actually one of their favorite pastimes. And at this point, he had already this was his 4th time doing it. Which is interesting because we haven't actually seen him in danger yet.
Yes.
He's already done it 3 times before.
Yeah, so you can tell he's a little unhinged, right? You can kind of tell.
Wow.
And I think, didn't he called Queequeg to also be his lawyer, executor, and legatee?
Like a tea, yeah.
So he has to now he's reeling other people into his nonsense.
Well, and he I mean, this is just another hint from Melville that the guy overconnects. Right?
Yeah.
He just puts a lot of things together that maybe aren't or shouldn't be together.
Yeah. And then we move on to chapter 50, and this is all of the sailors responding to Fedallah and the mysterious stowaways who are actually 100% approved by Ahab, and how strange it is to have Ahab not only going down into a boat himself, which is apparently somewhat debated, but like not just to coordinate the other boats, but to actually try and capture the whale themselves, and just how very odd and unusual this is. And apparently this Fedallah is like Indian or Persian or Pakistani, and just kind of, this Melville isn't the only person that I've gotten this impression from. If you read a lot of writing from this era from, let's say, American or English authors, they look over to these Eastern countries, India, China, and just see like a cultural stasis there, that things have always kind of worked the same way there. And it's not like they never have wars or famines or upheaval there, but there's this stability which they contrast with the progress of the West and the rapid changes of the West. So he does a lot of that kind of a comparison again in this short chapter. So just that kind of there's a great line actually there. Now with the subordinate Fanters, what wonder remains soon waned away, for in whalers wonder soon wanes. Wonders soon wane. So a nice little bit of alliteration there. That was a fun line. So yeah, another short chapter.
Yeah, but it's important. A lot of these short chapters are actually, in many ways pointing out the most important things. Like that line in particular kind of tells you, you go through so many things that other people would consider wondrous that the idea sort of doesn't stick very long because there's a new wondrous thing right around the corner. And that's what's important. And he's hinted at this before, right? Like the whaleman's the greatest of sailors, and all this all this hyperbole that he uses. But here he's making the same point, just a little more sanely. Like, I don't know, there's a reason for that. And I would have to agree, like when you're out on the ocean like that, there's some, you run into something, you're going to learn a thing or two, son. And you're going to see things that, were impossible to you before you started sailing, as particularly on the ocean. The ocean's a whole different. If you sailed on lakes or whatever, even large lakes, so there's a few notable exceptions. That's not the same. Like there's a difference, that a very marked difference, we'll say, that comes up when you get into the ocean, especially with, like, lakes don't have swells. So that's one big difference. And so you keep running into new conditions and new things, right? First of all, you got to remember, when you're on a ship, even a very large ship, the ground underneath your feet is not stable in a way that it is when you're not on a boat.
Even on we've got ridiculous sized cruise ships now. Don't those get really stable?
Now they roll.
Wow.
Yeah, people have to take medicine. Yeah, they roll less than than whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty of super large cruise ships with that got caught in storms, and everything gets tossed about, everything gets broken, and yeah, that still happens. You can't really prevent boats from rolling. It's not actually possible. It's not a size of boat issue. You actually have to be anchored. and when they do, so like if you look at like oil platform technology and stuff, and I don't know a hell of a lot about it, but I know some basics just because I'm crazy, and I like to look up stupid things that mean nothing to me. And the way that they keep them stable is, you know, all about it's not about how tightly they're tethered to the ocean floor. It's actually about how much slack they have. It's like it's very backwards to our way of thinking, but also it's like the right answer. And so whenever you do any sort of ocean thing, you know, it's all about the slack in your lines, and that's a science all by itself, or rather an art, because I can't give you procedures for making properly slacked lines, but I can do it. Probably not as well as I should be able to, but I can definitely do it. Lots of people can not be taught to do that, and it's also not something you can learn through a procedure very easily. You really have to have a feel for it.
I liked the bit to the point of just kind of the this, what do you say, like the inundation of novelty that these whalers have, that there's always some new high, or something like that that's happening. And that he has this point right after the bit about, for in a whaler Wonderstoon Wayne, that he says that so many like random objects, and especially like people, just kind of show up and then become part of the crew. So they're just like people floating on bits of wreck and in canoes and stuff that just get recruited at sea, to the point where even like the devil himself could show up and then walk straight into the captain's cabin, and it wouldn't even really be that much of an excitement. It's
Right.
just like, oh yeah, this stuff just happens all the time.
We are out in the wild, that's for sure. That's for sure. Very, very far from Fargo, North Dakota at that point.
Well, it's the level of unpredictability of being on the sea, because everything about being on the ocean in particular is completely unpredictable, and so you really get a sense for that.
Yeah. All right, we get to chapter 51, the Spirit Spout, and it looks like he gives a rough map of the route that they were sailing, and I get the sense that have they crossed past the Cape of Good Hope yet, or is that comes in a future chapter, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, they're in the Atlantic Ocean.
So they're cruising the Atlantic Ocean.
The Azores are in the Atlantic Ocean, right? The
Okay.
Azores are right off of Spain and Portugal.
Okay, so they're looking for whales even in the Atlantic, even though it's not their primary cruising ground. And Fedala has got this very strange habit of watching at night, even though it's said that they just don't have enough light to hunt whales in the middle of the night. They haven't invented 10,000 watt spotlights to get these things to turn a little patch into day into night. But he still goes up there and he will call out the whales, and apparently they try and at least catch the big boat up to them. But every time that they catch up, they don't actually find it, and the spout never blows again. So the sailors, of course, every night that this happens, they say that it's the same whale, and obviously, of course, it's Moby Dick who's doing this to them, just to taunt Ahab there. And so the superstition catches out from the crew.
Yeah, but I mean, this particular chapter is really well set up, because what he's doing is, in the beginning, he just talks about, like you said, the map of where they're going, and he says, not 1 in 100 would lower. So he says, although whales are seen at night, not 1 in 100 captains would ever lower for the whales at night, right? And so that's more set up for Ahab's an unusual captain, right? Because he's trying to simultaneously set the stage for normalcy and this outlier sort of extreme behavior at the same time.
I like with Fidala there that he's, so these guys have been under the deck this entire time, and then now he's pretty much the guy that he's awake all night, or at least for his shift, and even to the point where it says that he had the same precision as if it had been day. And again, even though like no one would want to take that job if he actually called anything out, so it's like, why are you even bothering? And that his turban and the moon were companions in one sky. So he's making a lot of these kind of like lunar associations with this. Like, during the day, the guy just like completely disappears, but also he's the one that's kind of like seeing at night and everything. And then Ahab listens to him. So like Ahab's not really listening to any of his other guys, but here's these people who are unofficially part of the crew. That as soon as that guy calls out the whale, he immediately orders everyone to like get out of their hammocks and then lower for the whale, and like he has them lower multiple times, even though like no one could see anything, And but I just thought that was interesting. And then there's this line that says, while his one live leg made lively echoes along the deck, every stroke of his dead limb sounded like a coffin tap. On life and death, this old man walked. And I mean, like, I know we already have like all those set up for the foreshadowing for Ahab and everything, but I just really kind of like this thing where he's now like his sight is kind of like relegated to nighttime as well. Like everything is kind of, he's very much half and half there.
Yeah, we also get another one of these speculations that's obvious speculation. Right. So right at the end of 51, terrible old man, thought Starbuck with a shudder. How would he know what Starbuck thought?
Right.
Right. Sleeping in this gale, still thou steadfast eyest thy purpose.
Which is really, I mean, it's like Ahab, I didn't quite cover this, but Ahab, even when he's down in his cabin, he's always watching the compass that they have in the cabin there. And when Starbuck apparently saw this, Ahab was like this, sleeping, but with his eyes open at the ceiling compass, which is quite the sight to see. Like, maybe it's a high probability deduction that that's what Starbuck would think. Like, that's just wild, Ahab is he's just an interesting fellow. A little too interesting, probably.
And also, the only time he looks up is indoors. Like, that's just like generally speaking.
Yeah.
It's when there's like a close by ceiling, and that he's asleep when he looks up. It's just like, yeah,
Your eyes would just get dry.
Yeah. The other week, I had an instance where I woke up and I fell asleep for like an hour and a half. Like immediately after my alarm, I woke up, switched the alarm, and then fell asleep for an hour and a half with my eyes still open. Like it was as soon as I put the phone down, I just shut off again, and my eyes were still there. And I re-woke up, and it's like, yeah, your eyes get really dry just after a little while.
That's unusual.
I was very tired.
And I think it's at this point in this chapter that they start they start heading for the Cape of Good Hope. And it seems that as unreliable as Ishmael is, he's got the correct opinions about the Cape of Good Hope. Rather, Cape Tormentoso, as called of yore, for long allured by the perfidious silences that before attended us, we now found ourselves launched into this tormented sea, where guilty beings transformed into these fowls and these fish seem condemned to swim on everlastingly without every haven or show, or beat the black air without any horizon. So it's Cape of Good Hope is apparently a very unpleasant place to sail, probably even to this day with big motors. It's a little treacherous to handle. You'd like to have somebody who'd gone through it before.
So that's the other side of the Atlantic. The Cape of Good Hope is in Africa.
Okay, so they sailed down south and got near there.
Yeah, they sailed across and they sailed east to the European continent and sailed south to the African continent. So the Azores south, you get Africa.
Okay.
You get the Gold Coast, and I think the Cape of Good Hope is the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Similar problem, by the way, right? And, like, the oceans, people don't realize, like, the way they draw the ocean lines is actually works because there are constrictions in between all the oceans. So from there, you can continue east, basically go into the Indian Ocean.
For whatever reason, Google Maps does not name the capes here.
No, it's not named on Google Maps. You got to look it up in Google, and it'll tell you which country it's in.
But
So, like,
basically, they swelled out to sailed out here to Spain, sailed
Yep.
down south the coast of Africa, and kind of
Yep.
got near here.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's where they're headed for the moment. Like, and then they probably had you can see the Cape Horn is the edge is in Chile, right? So it's the south edge of Chile, and you can see Antarctica there too. But I think the Cape of Good Hope is actually South Africa, if I remember correctly.
That's probably correct. I mean, where I live, we're very far from the ocean. You shouldn't expect me to speak with any confidence on these things. All right, chapter 52 is the albatross, and the albatross is the name of another ship that they're passing while they're I guess off the Cape of Good Hope at this point. Ishmael describes it as the craft was bleached like the skeleton of a stranded walrus. And they're having trouble with the horns to try and communicate to each other. But Ahab, apparently, the first thing he just asks is he asks about the white whale, which is probably not the first thing that you ask. It's more, do you want to attack here? But they aren't really able to communicate all that well. And because of the somewhat disturbed and treacherous seas that they're in, they pass through each other. And then Ahab notices all of these little fish that have been kind of congregating around the Pequod for a while. And then when they're passing by the albatross, all of the fish just dart away from them, and Ahab just notices this and says, "Swim away from me, do ye?" Just one of these weird, something that maybe happens a fair bit, but when you notice it, it becomes much stranger there.
Was very symbolic, right? So the other captain is asked about the white whale, and immediately drops his trumpet that he uses to be heard, and then they can't quite make out what he's saying. And Ahab doesn't come right out, Ishmael doesn't come right out and say, like, "Oh yeah, white whale," and he got nervous, right? But also, right, he uses the symbolism with the fish to say something weird's happening, a bunch of weird stuff's happening,
And it's funny because that's kind of how our relevance realization works too.
Yep.
How often does the sun rise, right?
Yeah.
And how often do you look at the sunrise and think of new beginnings?
Yeah.
Because that does happen. It does happen sometimes. You look at that sunrise and it really strikes you, and it's like, okay, the sunrise is every day, but today the sunrise is special, and then you connect it with. At least if you're not a Flatlander weirdo, you can connect it with other parts of your life. When you need to, it's there for you.
Yeah, it's always right. It's a potential that's always there, right? And then if three people watch the same sunrise, probably one of them will connect it in ways that the other two can't.
I wanted to point out I see RJ commented here about the Cape of Good Hope being named ironically, and I just want to mention that you definitely if it's a pleasant place, then you don't need to have good hope. That it's named after the thing you need to have if you go there.
Yeah. Well, I think though, if you're sailing the other direction, so the Cape of Good Hope is not the southernmost tip of Africa.
Hmm.
There's another lesser known cape that is the dividing line, if you will, between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. But I think if you're at that, you're past the worst of it if you're going the other way.
Hmm.
That, I think, is what it's really all about.
So would this be the Cape right here?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think it's not Cape Town, but it's very close to Cape Town.
Okay.
Yeah, there's the problem with peninsulas is that, as anybody who sails knows, there's multiple peninsulas. There's never ever one. There's always like 17 billion. So you can always, it's fractal. Like, you want self-similar fractality, grab a peninsula.
Well, that's how they
Almost,
generate the terrain in procedurally generated video games like Minecraft and Dwarf Fortress. Is they use fractal math patterns, and it works really well.
Benoit Mandelbrot invented that at IBM in the 60s or 50s or something stupid. Yeah, he actually invented that, or invented the math for it, and somebody else used the math, something like that. If you go to a map and you look, so you could take something like, because this is a great way to understand scale. Almost nobody knows what the Iberian Peninsula is. You can look up the Iberian Peninsula, and then as you zoom in, there's more peninsulas in the Iberian Peninsula, and then all those peninsulas have peninsulas. It just gets crazy. So, and somebody knows what the Iberian Peninsula is. Yeah, but the Iberian Peninsula is not that small, but yes. Yeah. And then there's peninsulas all over that peninsula, and there's peninsulas over that peninsula. And then as you get into the other peninsulas, they get more peninsula-like. Yeah, there's just peninsulas everywhere. That's really, yeah, there's peninsulas on peninsulas all over the place.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Anyway, any map, by the way. Any map. Go ahead. It's fun. It's fun. Yeah, you don't need a Mandelbrot fractal generator. You just use the Earth. It's right there. That was the problem he was trying to solve, was how do you measure the distance of a coastline? It turns out you need fractal math, and you can get much closer than you can, we'll say, without it.
I wanted to mention, so it, like in the previous chapter, but calling into this one, that there is he mentions that there's like sea ravens following behind the ship. And so, like, with a lot of, I think it was like a couple of the biblical prophets, they refer to them as like being fed by ravens. So, like, they feed on bad news, more or less.
Ezekiel
Yeah.
was fed by
Yeah.
ravens after he was driven, after he called down the drought on Israel, punishing whose sins? Whose sins was Elijah punishing? King Ahab's.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
And the funny thing here is that, so normally, like, that indicates like, okay, you're going to be receiving bad news or something. Like, I think there was I don't remember if it was it Saint Dominic or Benedict. One of them was like, somebody attempted to poison their food, and like a raven snatched the poisoned food away, and it happened like multiple times, like multiple assassination attempts, and ravens just kept showing up and stealing the food. And but I just think it's funny that it's like you have this sort of like, oh, bad news incoming, and then the guy goes to like put the trumpet to his lips, and it's just like drops. It's just like, okay, well, we're not going to hear the bad news then, I also, and then right after that, Ahab tries to reach out again and says, ahoy there, this is the Pequod bound around the world. Tell them to address all future letters to the Pacific Ocean. And this time, 3 years, if I am not at home, tell them to address to, and then he's not able to give the address. And it's just like, yes, so much foreshadowing right there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the foreshadowing on this is brilliant. Yeah, there's a lot of good foreshadowing here.
Alrighty, we get into the Gam in chapter 53, and he talks about, he compares the ocean to the Pine Barrens in New York State, or the Salisbury Plain in England. We could also think about the middle of North Dakota, and this is a very realistic thing he's talking about, right? If like you are on a really obscure dirt road in the middle of North Dakota, and somebody drives by, there's a decent chance that you're just going to stop and like talk about things, you know. So it says that whalers are very commonly in the habit of doing this. They'll exchange letters. They'll bring newspapers to each other. They'll exchange news, and he talks about with that kind of, you know, he's having his chest pumped out, that all of these other different ships that you'll find on the ocean rarely ever talk to each other. Not merchant ships, not warships, definitely not slave ships, but the godly, honest, unobstentious, hospitable, social, free and easy whaler, they will stop and they'll have these gams. And so he proposes to add gams to the dictionary. Maybe that actually happened after after he proposed this, because this did sell fairly well. And then he talks about when the captain goes over to the other ship, because of the design of their whaling ships, he has to stand in the back. And there's like this little bit of pride where he's not going to hold on to anything while he's standing, because of course he wouldn't. But if the sea is a little bit rocky and these little narrow boats, as Marcus pointed out, are rocking back and forth, every once in a while he'll grab onto one of the oarman's hair and just like hold on for dear life, which is just kind of a humorous thing.
There's nothing to hold on to in those boats. Sorry, just saying, there's nothing to hold on to. It's also, you know, the unreliability, right? So he's giving you the definition of gam after the albatross, where they met a boat. So a sane narrator would have given you the definition before and not directly after, right? And there are reasons, you know, which he doesn't mention, which I find actually, you know, fascinating. There are reasons why whale ships exchange information and why other ships don't. So there's a few things going on historically, right? First of all, merchant ships are only going to trade with ports, generally speaking. And they don't have information for one another except about storms. And I think one thing that's not talked about here, but I'm fairly sure is true, it was certainly true of privateers, or pirates, as they're more commonly known. If you wanted to communicate storm conditions to another sailor, you raised flags. It wasn't a big deal. Like that ability to signal with flags was internationally well known. So they wouldn't have had a reason to do that. Slave ships, the same deal, right? It's just, you know, unfortunate things that shouldn't be cargo being cargo. So these other ships don't need a flow of information. There's no compelling reason to have one. And all of their stuff is directed at ports because they know what ports they're going to be at roughly when. Whaling ships, that's not true for, and there's zillions of them. Like there's this whole explosion from America about whaling, and now there's whaling ships everywhere. And whales move all the time. And so their need to do this exists. Whereas the need to do this with other sailors isn't a thing. It's just not required. So that's another factor that is sort of not in here, but probably should be understood when you're reading the book. RJ.
Hey guys.
Well, hey, there
Sorry.
he is.
You said hi right I was putting in my headphones, so you can hear me all right. But I'm popping on board for a quick gam.
Excellent. You that might win over Dances with Whales, although I'm still chuckling about Dances with Whales.
Oh, you guys are all crazy.
I wanted to point out, so this was probably the most comical chapter for me yet, because we also see Ishmael like at his most insulting to other people, probably that we've seen the entire book, and that he's leading with this sort of like this consistent false humility of the whaleman and everything, and that he starts with between the English and the Nantucketers. They say, oh, well, he builds up the English as though they're these elitists that refer to the Nantucketers as like sea peasants, and then he goes and he says, but where the superiority in the English whaleman does really consist, it would be hard to say, seeing that the Yankees in one day collectively kill more whales than all the English collectively in 10 years. But this is a harmless little foible in the English whale hunters, which the Nantucketer does not take much to heart, probably because he knows he has a few foibles himself. And then, like, that is the lightest one that he does, because then he goes, and there's the line that you read about, how godly and honest the whaleman is. And then he says, why is it that all merchant seamen and also pirates and man-of-war's men and even slave ship sailors cherish such a scornful feeling towards whale ships? This is a question it would be hard to answer. And then the rest of the chapter, he just spends insulting the other people. It's just like, yeah, I wonder.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's funny. There's some American exceptionalism, we'll say, sneaking out for sure. But it sounds well founded, and it kind of is. So it's too bad.
He goes after the pirates, and he describes the pirate captain and says he always sits in the stern sheets on a comfortable, sometimes cushioned seat there, and often steers himself with a pretty little milliner's tiller decorated with gay cords and ribbons. And he says,
Right.
And then for the tiller, the whaleboat never admits of such effeminacy, But then it's like, and then he describes the whale captain just getting tossed around and grabbing some guy's head.
Oh yeah, that's a detail I left out. So it is traditional with boats when you're swapping or meeting or whatever, that the senior officer sits above everybody else. And that was always the case. We should go back to that, by the way. Different discussion for maybe even another channel. Patriarchy is good. See navigating patterns. That status has to be maintained. And those boats are almost all like there's almost always a captain's boat, available for that purpose, right? But on a whaling ship there isn't, and because whaling boats are designed for one thing and one thing only: to kill whales. And so, yeah, it has to be improvised, but that signal of status has to be maintained, and that's what he's alluding to here. And I think that probably recent readers, those born in the past 80 years probably can't understand that was the norm for everything. There was always a head. The head was always made clear. It didn't have to be the top, right? But it could be an officer or, somebody connected or a representative. And they were always raised above everybody else on purpose. And yes, that works in psychology, which might be a hint as to why it was used. And it also might be a hint as to why you can't actually do away with that, or what might happen if you try. But anyway, back to Melville.
Judgment calls on patriarchy aside for the second. I think it's useful to bring to attention to audience members, like when they may have seen something like this, which for a lot of people is probably going to be something along the lines of it was one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies where they had a parlay, which is very different than a gam, but you do see a couple of gams going on. And Melville calls it out pretty well here without going to some stuff outside the book. It's that the lieutenants or the first mates essentially, they discuss on one boat and the captains discuss on the other boat. And it's a very interesting type of exchange where, in a way of thinking about it, the lieutenants momentarily become captains as well, albeit one of them is not on his own boat. So we still have this element of the stranger, this perhaps veiled function, as opposed to the, very clear and discernible and discerning function that the captain plays here, just generally looking at how Melville's deploying some of these structures. But the fact that it's for conversation, for information exchange, has both that patriarchal and matriarchal element in the same I guess, activity, you could say. And what captures my attention about the GAM is not so much what it is, but where it is in the book, which is right after all these foreshadowings, like the albatross, as we start to head into more dangerous waters, perhaps. And also, one captain's probably leaving an area, the other captain's probably going into it, just to point out that last piece of the symbolism.
True.
Yeah, I don't think they would want to be cruising the same grounds. That's a recipe for trouble right there. Want to keep a few miles at the closest between you and the closest other whaling vessel.
Yeah, but that ship had been out for 4 years or something, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yes. That's a wild lifestyle right there. I complain nonstop when I'm in Washington, D.C. for 2 months with all of the amenities of civilization right there at my fingertips.
I just one last thought that I have for this chapter. So right before, like immediately preceding when he talks about the captain, momentarily grabbing in a critical moment or two, grabbing the guy's hair, that he says that the reason why his hands are even out at all, because they're normally in his pockets to kind of show like a token of his prestige, is because of his commanding enormous heavy hands, that he's actually using it to balance himself. It's just like, it's all this just constant, it's like self-congratulating the whaleman. It's just so ridiculous.
I mean,
the hyperbole is great. It really is.
That's I don't know. What does looking up look like when you're a guy like Ishmael and you're at the very bottom?
Yeah.
Like, what do you see? What do you see there? And it's like there is a certain way that you got to carry yourself when you're in charge, and that's just to let people know that you are in fact in charge, and you're going to be, they're going to come to you when they've got problems, and you're going to be giving them orders there. So it's like, what else are you going to do? What else are you going to do in that scenario? You don't want to make a buffoon out of yourself when you've got to command the respect of 30 or 40 men and try to avoid a mutiny, which we get to hear about in the next chapter. There was no good way to put chapter 54 in here. I didn't want to have a really short reading followed by this entire chapter. So, but this one, I mean, I just love this chapter. It's so freaking funny the entire time through. But it's one of the longest chapters in the entire book. And when we get to the end of it, we're very close to the halfway mark on the book itself.
Good.
I did the math there yesterday, and at least by chapters, it's very close to the end pages. It's very close to the midway mark. This story. So what we get is a GAM with another boat called the Town Ho, which is Town Ho. Look, it's over there, it was manned almost entirely by Polynesians, and gave them strong news about Moby Dick. But the way that this story was given to the crew was via one of the people telling it to Tashtigo, who spoke in his sleep, and then had to fill in the rest of the story for the rest of the crew. And the captain never heard it. So this was just a crew story here. And the way that Ishmael decides to narrate this for us is in the setting of being in Lima, Peru, and apparently being the guest of honor in some place with some of the locals there. And I really wish I had the time to research this. I wonder if Melville himself wasn't making fun of the way these kinds of stories were written in contemporary literature, because you could just imagine it, and kind of like the little interruptions that come from the Lemayans will say is like, "Oh, senor, tell us more about this. We do not understand it." You can almost hear the and you can almost like watch a movie in your head about a story and the dialogue taking place this way. And again, with that unreliable narrator, was this really how you told the story? Were these guys really hanging on your every word and like being perfect exposition prompts for you? Not quite sure about that. So let me see if I've got the story straight. You've got somebody who's done a lot of sailing on Lake Erie. One of them, his name was Steel Kit, and then you've got the first mate Radney. Steel Kit is a large man. He's got a long beard and a commanding presence among the crew. And Radney, the mate, vineyarder, so he's from Martha's Vineyard, was just a small, short guy. After having manned the pumps that they needed to be manning for several hours because of a more serious than usual leak, Radney orders Steel Kit to sweep the deck, and that was a departure from the conventional order of things. That you've got people who are far down the chain of command to sweep the deck, swab the deck maybe, and keep that clean. There was some younger boys who would ordinarily be given that duty, and he had just gotten done with manning the pumps, which he had done a really good job at, and is apparently rather difficult work. So Radney orders him to do that anyway. Steel Kit doesn't like this and ends up slashing his jaw or beating him across the jaw with something.
Just punched him.
Oh, just punched him. Okay. All righty. I didn't remember that particular detail, but it really lays him out, and he's got blood coming out of his mouth and probably a broken jaw, which is a very serious injury and can be difficult to repair. That causes kind of a skirmish on the deck, and 10 people join Steel Kit in the mutiny there, and they end up coming to an uneasy peace where the 10 are in the forecastle, which is a different. I don't understand ships all that well, but you get the sense that from the forecastle hatch, they've got a very small space that's inaccessible from everything else.
Yep.
And so for a number of days, the captain is lowering water and food down in there, but the people refuse to come up. And then on one day, 7 of the mutineers come up and beg for mercy. Since they did it of their own accord, it doesn't seem like they were punished all that badly. And Steel Kit's one demand is that the captain give his word that they won't undergo a whipping. So that was I suppose, how you maintain order on a ship is, and this sort of transgression, no matter how bad Radney might have been out of line, like that needs to be responded with a certain amount of force and consequences, because otherwise you lose control of the crew. That's the sense that I was getting. So eventually, the other 2 up there decide to betray Steel Kit, and they all get hung up. And the captain is willing to whip the other 2, but Steel Kit says something to him, and he decides not to whip him. But then Radney comes out with a big bandage over his face. It's been like 2 weeks since he was initially struck. And he whips. Does he whip Steel Kit, or does he pull him off just
No,
before
he starts to, and then Steel Kit does the same whispering.
Yeah, so we've got a real force of nature here with Steel Kit, and he ends up not getting whipped because they saw a whale. Was that it?
Well, I want to add a bunch of stuff that's kind of missing, if I might, Father.
Sure. And I didn't have my notes here, so go ahead.
Well, this is pretty significant, right? Because again, we like unreliable narrator. Now, this is as told at the Golden Inn, right? So this is his repeating of a story that he told once before. How he got the story is not actually all that clear, but it is through the nightmares, effectively, of one of the crew members of the Pequod. I think that's really important, because you know, he's the worst unreliable narrator of our time because he basically admits left, right, and center in various ways that he's unreliable. And this is just one more example. So he's telling a story of telling a story that he heard from somebody's nightmares and pieced together later. It's like, what? What kind of madness is this? And the worst part is he is not even the author. So I give up. I give up. I don't even. But the important part here, to me is there are these gentlemen called the Lakemen, and they all came on together. So they've all worked together before, right? So there's this pre-loyalty, and the Lakemen, and this is why I mentioned earlier in this very video that this is significant. The Great Lakes, I have it on good authority. I haven't even been on a boat on the Great Lakes, although I've been around the entirety pretty much of Lake Superior, which is great if you get to the north side in Canada, and oh, it's beautiful up there. You can't stop anywhere on the road because all of their little rest areas are overgrown because their government can't govern. But that aside, I have some lovely pictures at the one or two places that weren't completely overgrown. That those lakes are large enough that they have many of the aspects of an ocean. And so there are squalls and very large ships disappear and have disappeared. We'll say in recent times, even there's a famous song, which I can't remember the name of, about
The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And
the Edmund Fitzgerald.
I mean, I wasn't the captain or I wasn't actively sailing, but we did charter a boat to fish for lake trout. And the original plan was we were going to leave at 6 a.m., but there were storms that night, so we had to wait till about noon for the water to calm down.
Yeah.
So that gives you that, like on a Minnesota lake, probably an hour after the storm's done and the winds died down, things are going to be settled down on it, but not on a Great Lake. The waves get too big for that quick a settling.
Yeah, they propagate out, and it takes the better part of a day to drive north around from, say, Thunder Bay, Canada, just hypothetically, which is where I was coming from, all the way around the lake. It takes like the better part of a day. It's not the north side of the lake. It's not small. It's not a small lake. It's not a small lake. You can look out over the lake and not see the other side in lots of places. So, including Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay can see anything. Thunder Bay, it just vanishes. Yeah, the Edmund Fitzgerald is a famous one with a song or two about it. But these guys are all used to the lakes, and even the lesser lakes. So Lake Champlain, which I'm a little more familiar with because I've been there a few times. That's on the border of Vermont and New York, so-called upstate New York, where all the Republicans live. That lake gets quite nasty in the storms too, and it's not very wide, but it's very long. It's a very long lake, and just from where it is. So they're together. Radney is an ugly old mule, and the implication from the way the story is told, or the retelling of the story, is that Steelkilt is not ugly. He's kind of buff. He's a Chad, and so the implication is that's where all the animosity is coming from. So this animosity is not justified because they're hard workers. And I mean, he describes him, which had made Steelkilt Charlemagne, had he been born son to Charlemagne's father. Just stupid lines like that. It's just so good. But see, there's also this element of, I don't even want to call it royalty because I'm talking about Charlemagne here, right? So it's kind of like royal of royalties or something, like Charlemagne's next level. What is it? 10% of the white population is directly descended to Charlemagne or something crazy. It's not quite Genghis Khan, but also, and then he just gets chased when he refuses because he's just gotten off shift. he gets chased with a hammer. Like the guy, like no fault to Steelkilt for this because he ain't doing anything wrong. And he warns him like 3 times before he takes action. Right? So there's a real sense that the ugly, stubborn, mule-like cretin who happens to be in charge is unfairly going after this guy for no good reason.
There's a ridiculous set of lines here that I mean, Ishmael just completely self-contradicts like one sentence to the next. And that he mentions a bit that when not only was Radney trying to threaten with violence Steelkilt, but it was over having him do additional work that like the boys on ship could have gone and swept the deck, and there was like pig droppings to pick up. And so he says that a pig had been allowed to run at large on the ship, and then immediately says, "Now, gentlemen, sweeping a ship's deck at sea is a piece of household work, which in all times but raging gales is regularly attended to every evening. It has been known to be done in the case of ships actually foundering at the time." So, like, even when they're sinking, people are still, like, sweeping. And he says, "Such, gentlemen, is the inflexibility of sea usages and the instinctive love of neatness in seamen, some of whom would not willingly drown without first washing their faces," after he just said that they allowed a pig to go running around the ship.
Yeah, it's the absurdity, the deliberate absurdity is interesting.
It's a long book. If this wasn't entertaining to read, it'd be very painful.
Yeah,
that is also
Some
true.
say it still is, but no, I like this chapter because of the juxtapositions. I want to go back a step and just point out for people who aren't familiar with geography that Peru also has a lot of lakes, very large lakes. They're known all over the world for. I think one of them, if I'm not mistaken, even has seawater in it, and it's like a mile above sea level. I don't want to misquote what the lake name is. It might be Lake. Yeah, I don't want to say it, but you guys can look it up at home. But the point here is that Melville is kind of pointing at and choosing these different lake associated areas, as opposed to what's going on here in the story is out on the open ocean. And if the lake is a small ocean surrounded by land, then there's a lot of microcosms here as well, which for me, I see that then being placed in line with the last couple of chapters we've seen. You've got this foreboding of the albatross, then you've got the GAM, which is this exchange, this new information, this new territory, and then you've got perhaps even further allusions, although, let's presume we haven't read the book for some people because they haven't. There's more foreboding at the very least of these stories in these inside out versions of each other. If you're telling a story by a lake about being on the high seas, there's a level of inversion there that isn't just turning something on its head. And then soon we'll actually go inside the whale as well.
My next sort of note that I have in here, which is just so in the previous chapter, Ishmael is going and like just bad mouthing everybody else and everything like that to make his people look better. But then now that he has these additional characters that he's then like, it's like he can't just tell the story that he told these people. He has to say how they reacted as well, because he needs that additional support to just how great the story was and everything. And that he's talking about the Erie Canal and the canal guys, and the people there, he says, don't know what that is. And he says, "Oh, you must have heard of the Erie Canal." And he says, "Nay, senor, hereabouts in this dull, warm, most lazy and hereditary land, we know but little of your vigorous north." And it's just like, yeah, it's like you're really overplaying your hand there, pal. And then immediately he tells the guy to refill his cup, and it's just like, come on.
Yeah. Well, and it is significant in a way because And here's a bunch of history I don't know anywhere near well enough, mainly because I got sick on my way to save my friend from insignificant amounts of snow in Michigan one year. The Erie Canal is a sea change in the formation of the United States, because it cuts across the Appalachian Mountains, and it makes a connection with the western, well, really the central now, it was the western then, part of the country. And so now, without having to deal with the St. Lawrence River, you can get from Lake Erie right to New York City, the port. And yeah, it's Albany to Buffalo. That's actually the song, right? This is a famous, or at least it was famous enough that I knew it, song about the canalers and going from Albany to Buffalo. I think actually the Erie Canal goes from Albany to Buffalo, and then you go down the Hudson the rest of the way. And that saves you a bunch of work, because otherwise all the goods have to go out to sea basically through Canadian waters. Effectively, because the St. Lawrence is entirely in Canada. And even if you wanted to go through the Hudson, from the St. Lawrence, you have to go through Montreal. So you're already stuck in Canada land, right? And so this is actually a big deal for trade. And those waters up there, out at where the St. Lawrence begins or whatever, the ocean, you don't want to be in a boat there ever, any time of year. Terrible. It's too far north. It's always cold. It's absolutely the worst. And then you have to sail so far south to get back. It's not good for trade within the U.S. because you have to sail way east and way west, right? But when you can go from Albany to Buffalo, or Buffalo to Albany in this case, and then Albany down to the port of New York City, this is part of what builds New York City as a big port, because it isn't until the late 1800s. So after Nantucket is the largest port because of whaling, New York City becomes the largest port after they dredge the harbors, which they hadn't previously done. And this is also when Cornelius Vanderbilt, the first of the nouveau riche, basically comes into his own and makes all his money with sailing vessels transporting around the New York City area from Long Island and New Jersey and probably all the way down to Philadelphia and stuff. They're doing all this transport by sailing ship, small sailing ships mostly for Vanderbilt. He sells the whole thing and then goes into railroad.
Was that in the book or in our conversation? I believe it's actually in one of the chapters that Melville makes an allusion to that kind of pretty momentous occasion, with the switching from seaport shipping to railroads. Happens around the time that this book is being published as well. And channels through the Appalachia, the railroads start cutting channels through the land itself. And if you think of a ship like a train as being chariots, then you can walk into some of the symbolism that Melville is likely deploying here. Right.
Yeah, and there's the Erie Canal. No, it goes further than that for sure. The Erie Canal definitely changes the game because it allows this direct passage into the Hudson River, and therefore down into the port, right, directly to the sea. In the same way that in Lowell, Massachusetts, the reason why they choose Lowell, they start in Waltham, Massachusetts, and they go, which is on the Charles River, and they go up to Lowell to the Merrimack River, is not to use the river, it's to use the Middlesex Canal, and that's what makes the shipping cheap. Yeah, there it is, all the way to Albany. Yeah,
and there's one more point that I'd like to tack on to that, which is this also transforms the Mississippi. Right. And people can think of what the Mississippi would have used to be along the lines of Mark Twain. And now it becomes, as much as an artery of trade as it was before, it's become almost effectively like the Nile. because you've got goods going all the way up and down. It's bringing all this, the breadbasket of America that's now been connected to the rest of the world through these shipping lanes, these canals, and through these railroads later on in the future. But that gives you a brief snapshot of what Melville is pointing at. The boundaries between frontiers are being broken down through technology. There's a fun way that people experience this in the backside of the world wars with airplanes, and a fun quote, which I'll use here, by Douglas Adams, which is, he's talking about time machines in his book, but he says that, travel has made everywhere like everywhere else.
Yeah.
And so there's that breakdown, that flattening there that is going on, albeit through trade, through exchanges of the stranger, through these gams of trade that's been going on here. And that's engendering a sort of a mutiny in a different type of way.
Yeah, it's certainly an upheaval, right? And the fact that it's Lakemen, who are strong and good looking and, bound together on a whaling ship, not even affecting a mutiny, right? But just righting a wrong and then getting punished for it. But then ultimately, I don't know if you want to continue from there, Father. I just wanted to add all those other little pieces, but you didn't quite finish the best part of the story, in my opinion.
Yeah. So Steel Kit is going to get his vengeance and against Radney. So they're going to do a few things. Radney apparently falls asleep looking over the edge of the boat when he's on one of his watches or one of his duties, and also they're deciding they're just going to get off this boat as quickly as possible, so they won't be calling out for any whales even if they see them, because apparently even when your ship is taking on much more water than is ordinarily the case, they'll still lower for whales because these guys got to get their money made, right? These whalemen got to get their money made. It reminds me kind of like, this is a bit of a stretch, but it reminds me of like Roughnecks on an oil crew, and just how much stupid amount of work they'll put in, but they'll get paid really well. So that kind of spirit there. And so, but one of them ends up calling out for a whale anyway. And what do you know? It's actually Moby Dick. So Radney ends up getting taken down by the whale. Oh gosh, I can't remember exactly what happens. He either went down or got like chomped up by Moby Dick himself, and they could see his clothes hanging out of Moby Dick's mouth as he's making his escape. And they get into port. They obviously didn't get Moby Dick, and the 9 remain. The 10 Lakemen abandoned ship basically. So they're not getting paid, but they run off. And the they commandeer a canoe somehow and are just going to try and get home all by themselves. And there was this bit about them meeting up in the canoe with the town ho. I can't remember if the whaleboat ended up taking a break for like 6 days or not. But they ended up getting repaired, and where Steel Kit is, gentlemen, none know. But upon the island of Nantucket, the widow of Radney still turns to the sea, which refuses to get up his dead. Still in dreams sees the awful white whale that destroyed him. And then Ishmael promises us that he had spoken with Radney I've since seen and talked with Steel Kit since the death of Radney, and he swears all of this on the Book of the Gospels, which is still a ritual performed in the Catholic Church. When you're taking an oath of office, you place your hand upon these holy Gospels, and that's how you swear that oath. So I've taken that oath twice, once for diaconate ordination, once for presbyterate ordination. A priest, when he takes the pastorate of a parish, also makes that oath on the Gospels. So there might have been some details I missed. Feel free to fill them in, gentlemen.
Yeah, well, I forgot to mention too, Radney is part owner of the boat.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Steelkit never had to take his revenge. Moby Dick came and did that for him.
Well, but remember, he whispered to the captain and to Radney, who, upon hearing the whisper, don't mete out the punishment. So there's something going on there, which obviously is deliberately being hidden from us, right? Explicitly, deliberately being hidden from us.
And Ishmael didn't make it up.
According to Ishmael, yeah.
He
Right.
didn't make up what the whispering was.
Yes. Yeah, true. He didn't. And yeah, and this is another, like, you want clever storytelling? I'll give you double clever story. I'll see you a clever storytelling and raise you 1,000,000. Yes. Right. Because the things he will make up and the things he leaves out are just fantastic.
All of it's probably like, what's going to be the better story? You know, it's going to be a much better story if I have access to Starbucks slots at this juncture. But
Yeah.
if we don't really know what Steelkit said to the captain and Radney, well, that's just a little extra spice right there. That's a little sprinkling of interest.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Because this is a horrible way to tell this story. Because again, to the point, he keeps getting interrupted by his hosts, who are like, "Tell us about this." Like,
Senora.
there's this one point.
I'm going to disagree. I actually think it's a great way of telling the story.
That's right. You're allowed to be wrong about one thing a day.
I could be wrong with plenty of things, but like to quickly make the point, I think going back to what I was saying about these last 3 chapters when viewed together, especially, if he's not, if you're going to flip the narrator inside out and make him untrustworthy, right, and then you're going to place that position again in a flipped inside out context, then you can start to see a through line that isn't, inside out. And it doesn't really make sense in the English, but I can gesture at least 1 or 2 other examples that is, usually looked at in English and literature texts, one being Dante, the other being Camus' The Fall, where you have these unreliable narrators taking someone from the bottom to the top. And I see Ishmael doing that here.
Well, so to your point, there's this sort of flipping and kind of like a raising up to flatten type of thing. When you have this whole meandering talk about the canalers, which is just like so out of place. It's just he gets interrupted, and then he retells it like he's irritated with them, a little bit, and then he goes on to this whole thing. But then he takes the opportunity to describe these things to kind of like justify, violence at times. So he goes and he says, by some curious fatality, as it is often noted of your metropolitan freebooters, that they ever encamp around the halls of justice, so sinners, gentlemen, most abound in holiest vicinities. And then he goes afterwards to say, one of the prime redeeming qualities of your man of violence is that at times he has a stiff arm to back a poor stranger in a strait, just as to plunder a wealthy one. And then one of his interlocutors there goes and says, "Oh, there's no need to travel. The world's one Lima." So he's just kind of like, now we've raised up Lima, which he just shut down completely, beforehand, using the kind of characters that he invented of these people that he's speaking to. And then now, like, that I think precedes then the plot to murder, was it Randy? What was his name again?
Radney.
That he was going to smash him in the head with it. I think it was like a sock with a metal ball or something like that. And then at that point, then they wind up lowering for the white whale. But like he does this whole thing to like kind of justify violence, and it's like there's no need for it anyway. And then I thought it was interesting that so he's there with the other lakemen who had worked with him before, and they're down there for like, I think it's like 5 or 6 days in the dark, just pumping constantly because the leak is just getting worse. And eventually, like, some of the other guys go and give up, and then there's just like 3 of them down there doing the entire ship's worth of work. and then the other guys turn on Steelkilt and like actually tie him up and give him up, and then all of them get strung up anyway. And but he never takes revenge on them. Like when they wind up deserting the ship, like they get on the canoe, and then they even outrun the captain after they encounter him on the sea, and show up to Tahiti first, and then sail off, wherever they're going to go. And but yeah, I just thought that it was interesting that it's like, here's this guy, it's all built up like, oh yeah, Steelkilt's gonna do some violence, and then he actually never does anything other than uppercut a guy. And like that was actually his entire thing. And then he even gets betrayed by his own guys and never turns against them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too because, it's the reliable narration of the unreliable narrator. Where at one point he mentions Moby Dick, and he said it was Moby Dick, and then it's Moby Dick, cried Don Sebastian, Saint Dominic, Sir Sailor. But do whales have christenings? Whom call you Moby Dick? Right? And so he doesn't, he's not doing the set and setting the story correctly, which is hysterical given Melville's set and setting section already, where he's done a brilliant job of set and setting. His narrator for the book is apparently retarded, can't tell a story. The person telling the story tries to keep interrupting him. And it's funny too, because, to Castle's excellent point. So when the last three are down there, they all have these, alleged conceptions in their head. This is another thing. Like, he couldn't have known any of this. This is ridiculous. It's insane that anybody could know this. Right? They have these conceptions in his head where there's like, okay, Steelkilt is like, I go up first. And they're like, no, that, they each want to go up first because they each want to be the first to give up so they won't be harmed. And that's why they end up tying him up. Because then then we'll all have given each other up and therefore or something. It's a very strange way to think about it. And so it seems unlikely that that's how it would have happened. So it's an interesting way to tell the story because, again, he's telling the story to somebody. That's a story we really don't know how he got it. We have no idea, right? And he's telling the story of that previous storytelling rather than just telling the damn story like a normal person would do. And for reasons which aren't clear other than his own self-aggrandizement or something. Like, there's no... Yeah, I mean, he's really, just kind of showing off. He could just tell the story straight. There's no reason to make it about the story he told when he was at the Golden Inn in Lima.
Well, let's take him at face value for a second and assume he is telling the story relatively straight for a second. And, what is the pattern he's tracing out with his story? If you take the rebellion element out of it for a moment and kind of keep in view what Moby Dick is beyond just being a whale, then you, at least from my perspective, you start to see commentary from Melville on things like what happens when you no longer, I guess, toe the line, to borrow an aphorism from the sailing world, but what happens when you're no longer in full alignment with that shared goal of the ship? That of course creates a breakdown when you're looking at it through the lens of authority. That's a challenge. That's your rebellion. But it's about not being aligned on a certain level of analysis. And Melville is relaying that to us here in a sort of flipped around way, still pointing at that failure to align to something can create a breakdown just as much as all committing to an alignment that we've seen in previous chapters with, I forget which chapter it is, but he makes the harpooneers swear to him. He makes the rest of the crew swear to him. It's this building thing. And now we're seeing the other extreme for the last couple of chapters. And then, again, I'm in my mind, I'm thinking about what's going to come next, which is going inside the actual whale itself, be that an ideology, be that a shared commitment, whatever that thing is. He's really pointing at the structure here, at least from what I'm able to see.
Yeah, RJ. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, in some ways, this is really easy, right? This is the summary of the book. This chapter is the summary of the book. That's all it is, right? Like, hey, you don't need to read any further. This is the whole thing. Set and setting, short version. Here it is, right? Um, but but you're right. I want to add a little nuance to what you were saying, 'cause I think it's what you're saying is good. But I think what's missing in that is that Melville is very cleverly showing you multiple things at the same time. One is the way in which the hierarchical immediate structure needs to be complied with. Otherwise, things break down. The other one is the corruption of the hierarchical system away from the virtues and values. So the virtues and values in this case are, look, there's a certain way we do this. There's a certain way we treat people when we're jealous, because this is a jealousy story, right? This is fundamentally a jealousy tale. When we're jealous and we try to enforce the hierarchy, because jealousy corrupts, you're going to get a corrupted system, and ultimately it's going to end badly for you. Because it ends badly for the captain too, just not quite as badly as it did for Radney. So they each apparently get cursed in slightly different ways, right? Which is also interesting and important, because Radney's the one who violates the natural order, we'll call it, right? Not the structural institutional order of man. That's a different order, right? That's an imposed order by imperfect creatures. The natural order is beyond that, right? And that's what he's kind of hinting at here, is that the natural order has been upset, and the institutional order can't hold that because it will break apart. And the appeal for that, one way to look at this, is to say it's all ethereal. It's all non-material. It's a curse. It's a whispered, undefined curse is the thing that rights the world, in essence, right? It's the appeal to something higher and beyond, if you want to think about it that way. That's what rights this situation ultimately, right? It doesn't fix it in the moment. There's a little bit of mitigation. People don't get whipped, right? But now they want off the ship, and it's not clear if they called out the whale because they knew that was their vengeance whale. Because right, and then there's all this, we would call it maybe supernatural is the best way to talk about it, association with Moby Dick as justice, Moby Dick as the force of righteousness, Moby Dick as the Leviathan, because he used Leviathan all over the damn place in the beginning, right? That rights the wrongs, right? That flips the script, that enforces the natural order as ordained by virtues and values, and not the order, the man or institutional order as ordained by man. And so all of this symbolism is wrapped up in the summary of the book chapter. It just happens not to be called Moby Dick. It would have been funnier at some point if he just named this chapter Moby Dick. Like
or the whale.
Self-reference.
So I want to pause you right there, because I think it's really important from my perspective. Two things. One is which in this chapter we can see, the different orders that Melville is picking up on that Mark expounded upon a moment ago. But the breakdown of, as Mark terms it, the order as imposed by man, at the same time as trying to point at, not proper as in this is how it should be, but, proper in the sense of like the Tao flowing and things working together, functioning, cooperating, those are set against each other in a way in the story. And the thing that cues me in on those being juxtaposed in the real meaning of the term is something I actually want to throw to you guys, which is Does anybody else notice a lack of the mediator functionally or symbolically here in the story generally, or especially here in this chapter? Because Ishmael, for me, he plays that mediator, albeit perhaps dishonestly or not forthrightly at times. But here he's very much not mediating anything. And it's the introduction of new information, new knowledge without the mediator that sets part of this off. So there's a lack of the correct cooperation or successful. I don't like the word correct. Successful cooperation between the masculine and the feminine functions aboard the ship. And because it's Melville, he's pointing at this more broadly. But do you guys notice that here, or am I projecting perhaps?
No, I would say that's really insightful, right? So don't particularly like the move, but you invoked the divine feminine, so I guess we got to go there. It's divine feminine month here in the Peterson sphere anyway, with Mitchell's excellent interview. I think that effectively this is very much about improper mediation, right? So what should normally happen is the captain should hear about the injustice and then mediate based on the story. But in this case, he doesn't. He immediately takes Radney's side, right? And the implication is the captain should have realized what was going on, that it was a jealousy problem and had nothing to do, right? And so who's more wrong, the guy with the hammer or the guy with the fist? Well, I'm here to tell you, in case this is confusing, because I don't think it's hard, the guy with the hammer, right, who repeatedly chases the other guy who doesn't need to run because he's bigger, right, and he's more capable, it clearly warns him off multiple times, and then follows through, which is like, if you're going to warn somebody off, you follow through, right? You never point a gun at somebody you don't intend to shoot. It's the same principle. Like, yeah, you gotta be ready to go. He warns him off, and he doesn't kill him. And so the killing part, I think, is, to your earlier point, Father, is purely Ishmael being hyperbolic and Ishmaelian, dare I say. There is also no proper mediation between the whale and the punished. Right? This whispering of a threat, which is apparently what happens. Again, it's not. We can't really know, but it seems to be what's happened. He's cursed him. Is improper mediation, right? It's wrong to let the Leviathan take care of this for you outside of the ship. He's outside of the ship, right? So this problem is dealt with by forces beyond the ship's control. So there's all this layered symbolism because of the lack of mediation by the captain. And we don't know why that is, right? We also don't have enough context to understand, well, why didn't the captain, again, the captain must have known that Radney was jealous. And the captain, always has the authority to make the promise that they asked for. This is the other thing is, they don't immediately rebel, or they're not even starting a mutiny. All they're doing is saying, you're not going to whip us for this. We're going to go behind this barricade. And then he's like, well, you can't stay behind the barricade. And they're like, listen, we'll come out if you promise us no reprisals because we didn't do anything wrong. And the failure of negotiation, and another word for negotiation is cooperation, and vice versa. You can swap those words pretty nicely. Thank you very much. The failure of negotiation, the failure to cooperate on the part of the captain, because it is on the part of the captain, is significant here, because that is the failure. The failure is in the rigidity. The rigidity comes from the lack of negotiation, right? And the lack of accounting. Like, you're not accounting. Like, if somebody pulls a hammer, I punch him with my fist. I'm not going to jail. Like, that's never going to happen. Right? That's unrealistic unless something's gone wrong with the system. And the thing is, that will always be true. Like what I just said, right? You can't add more context and make that false. the guy with the we'll say mechanical advantage or the overwhelming power, physical force advantage, is not a fair situation to be in, right? So a show of lesser force to solve the problem is always appropriate. Like there's no conditions where that's not the right answer. And so the fact that the repeated negotiations go on at all the layers, right? And then they fail and he's using a curse, right? To right the immediate wrong and set everything straight. But there's a cost for a curse, obviously, right? And there's cost on both sides, and that both sides pay the cost. One side doesn't care because it got the better deal for sure, right? But the captain and Radney, of course, end up, basically flat out. Like Radney loses his life. The captain's voyage is completely wrecked.
I think all of that's true, and I think you're looking an awful lot at the actions of the captain and Radney and their failures and the consequences that come from their failures. I think all of that is very apropos and useful and worth paying attention to. We can look at Steel Kit, and Steel Kit came from a Christian culture, and he could have imitated Christ in this, where even when he was wronged, opened not his mouth, but like sheep led to the shearers, humbly submitted to even his very unjust treatment. And that would have led to the saving of Radney's life, even if it might in many eyes not seem worth saving, and his two friends not being whipped, and they still would have had the option of just bailing out on this cruise that was not being conducted very justly or honorably. So that was also an option, was an option that was not taken. And, I don't judge Steel Kit too harshly for standing up for his rights in the way that he did, but that was also still an option. And then Radney's widow would not have to pay the price for Radney's sins.
I would definitely agree. And I think that that's a really good point. And you do see this sort of thing with, that Steel Kilt is also down there. Like he has all of the other lakemen down there, and he pretty much subjects them to days of darkness, just pumping away constantly. And they were exhausted after like a few hours before the Radney incident. So it's like they're down there just constantly working for days, just water up to their ankles at least the entire time, just like miserable conditions and everything. And then so like people do kind of, there is that sort of double mutiny that winds up happening where people, his own guys kind of mutiny against him, until actually everyone of those 9 guys have actually done that. So like he does sort of lose his mind in that sense, and like it's his pride that's keeping him in the dark as well. So he just gets the better deal.
Yeah, it's certainly a reciprocal application of corruption, right?
There are certain things that justice alone can't guarantee, that we'll say mercy can fill the gap, and sometimes even attain things for the greater good that justice and strict application of the law cannot obtain, which is why, at least in canon law, you're always going to hear about canon law from me, the judges have a certain amount of discretion in applying penalties in particular cases. You need to be careful about that, because not applying penalties too frequently can be actually a sign of weakness and will promote further disorder. But every once in a while, not applying the penalty is the correct thing to do, and it serves the whole better than a rigid application of a penalty.
I would agree.
If I could
with you
bounce the
for
ball on mercy for just a second. There's a significant use of absence that I notice throughout the chapters we've seen so far. Melville points out that, at one point the women are certainly absent from the boat. The last time we see one is it's the sister of one of the captains who's in charge of the inventory of the food supply. Then we skip forward, and there's the significant absence of Moby Dick. Although we're getting ever closer to him. There's the absence of proper mediation, and going back to Mercy, which is, you could look at Mercy as the absence of severity. And I say all that to point at that things are out of balance, and the more out of balance they become, certain things start to reciprocally narrow, and other things start to reciprocally open. And because we're in this inside out situation, what's opening is experience of the whale, and what's closing is, in a certain way, the mercy. We're getting more tension, more examples of violence, a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Corporeal, perhaps, because we're going to get into like the very, what makes up a whale pretty soon. But to put a bow on it, the absence of mercy seems to go hand in hand with the absence of mediation, and the tyranny that is engendered by that, the breakdown that is engendered by that is something that has been very present to me in today's session.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Father, there's a real threat of death from Radney. So
I'm saying what he could have done is he could have just swept the deck. That's what I'm saying. But before he got to the hammer point.
I don't think so. I kind of doubt it.
There were opportunities there, but it would require like that steel kill was already.
It would require a level of heroic humility that is not common.
It wouldn't have worked. Radney would have pushed him to his limit anyway.
Right, he was picking the fight.
Yeah, but even after the Radney thing, when they're in the barricade, like it's kind of tough because the captain had 2 pistols out as well, and he was trying to aim. But there is the point where he says, like, you have to promise that you're not going to flog us. And the captain doesn't say, no, I'm going to do it anyway. He does say, like, no promises, but come out, And it's just like, it is kind of difficult because it might have been that it's just like, okay, like you came out and you submitted and everything, and that's fine. But also he might have gotten shot in the face. So I don't know. Like, I mean, we're also talking about people who are inherently like savage type guys that are going to be on this one. Like the right thing to do is submit early and often, but also like these guys, I don't know.
Well, but the framing of the story is that they were always hard workers who always snapped to and put in their all from the beginning.
Yeah, that's the Christ story.
The story only plays out this way if the jealousy is present, which is part of where I'm trying to gesture at through the point about mercy, which is that if you're only going in one direction, you're going to get off balance. It takes looking up and looking down and, as an aside, looking forward to be able to be successful. And Radney's not doing that. Radney's looking forward so hard that he's not able to look up, which is where I'm saying he's picking a fight.
And so's the captain. Well, Radney, I think, is looking down explicitly, or across at beauty or something and goodness, and saying I don't have any of these traits. And the captain seems to be doing the same, because when the captain gets into the port, it's not the lakemen that leave. It's almost everybody takes off from that boat. So it's not like, the captain is right. No one seems to think that. So
right. I'm not defending the captain or the Radney at all. I think they are very clearly transgressing. But when you have like the transgression, multiplying, and the counterforce multiplying and multiplying, eventually it's going to blow up.
Yeah.
And bad things are going to happen.
Yeah, but that can be done by one side, no matter what. And this is what everybody misses, is the asymmetry of that situation. Right. Like people can always hijack planes and fly them into buildings. And like, that's always an option. Doing nothing about that is not an option, though. Like, this is where the problem comes in. Like, you can't meet that with nothing or kindness, because that's how it all falls apart. Like, at some point, proper order has to be restored. And that's why the proper order restoration is by something outside the ship that is also a leviathan, that in another context, which we'll say is the larger context of the book. So interestingly, outside the context of the chapter where Moby Dick is the good guy, because Moby Dick is the good guy, right? Maybe Moby Dick's not the good guy in the, I don't know, I haven't finished the book. Maybe Moby Dick's not the good guy in the larger context, or maybe he is. It is this constant struggle, and I haven't read it, but I hear on good authority that crazy book with the short title and no author, this theme about having to do something terrible to right the wrongs that have built up over time is a recurring theme, and that it happens, and that it's necessary, and that you can't get around it. But nobody seems to like that because it's hard. But also, I don't see a way around it. And if someone's got a way around it, let me know, because I got plenty of counter examples for you that show that ain't going to be true. But bring it.
It depends. It depends what you mean by terrible, but that seems like a conversation for another day. I think there's more than one way to go about something, and I don't know if if the problem is over severity. I don't know if a terribly severe action is the one that's called for. Perhaps the terribly kind action won't just put things back in balance. I like to think about, cooking. You can't just add things in equal measure to balance out a dish. So there may be a third way here that is not just engaging in severity or violence or abstinence from violence. That's going to be what's pointed at potentially.
Well, because actions aren't terrible. Actions are neutral in the world. That's the problem, right? It's the telos that determines the terribleness of the action. Again, this is the answer nobody likes, or the goodness of the action, right? Like if you give homeless people money constantly, you enable their worst behaviors that likely made them homeless, right? It's called enablement, right? And so actions in and of themselves are not good or bad. It depends on the final cause. It depends on the telos. And this is what everyone struggles with, because nobody likes that answer. I got that, but I'm pretty sure the Bible's full of that answer all over the place. All the Bible stories I know of have that answer everywhere. So there's always this element where work has to be put in, and that effort is important. And also, sometimes effort has to be not put in. Like, some things have to unfold, right? And so timing is always an issue, because there's a time not to smack somebody to wake them up, and there's a time when you have to smack somebody to wake them up. Sorry, but again, it's not the action, right? It's the timing and the telos that matter, and how that unfolds is important. And that I think is what the story is juxtaposing here. It's saying, because you didn't do the right thing in the beginning, and deal with this, because look, there's this rivalry going on between these two people, this unfairness that it has to be clear to everybody. And the captain's had nothing to deal with it the whole time. Like, he's already guilty by the time he's already complicit in this problem. And then when it unfolds the way it unfolds, like, the guy's got a hammer in his hand. I don't care if his jaw is broken, he's bleeding. He's got a hammer in his hand. And the only thing that happened to his jaw is broken and he's bleeding on a ship. Let me just tell you, if that happened to me on a ship, the guy wouldn't have a jaw that was bleeding. I could tell you that. Like, it's a ship, man. I don't know what to say. Like, this isn't going to get any better, but it is going to get a hell of a lot worse. So we better get it over with now. So I don't, why that wasn't a clear hint to the captain that, like, bro, you should have known this is going to happen or something like this, and you should be grateful that it happened this way. And he's not. He's absolutely not. He's totally, I'm not going to guarantee anything. And then the worst part is, the Lakemen don't do anything wrong. at all. So there's no reason why the captain can't say, hey, they're all off the hook, but you, and he doesn't do that. Why not? They haven't done anything wrong at all. They've been nothing but good sailors. So he's just reacting to some extent to a threat to his authority.
Well, I have two thoughts. Well, one thing for the folks at home, if the statement that all actions are neutral but the telos matters is too spicy for you, it occurred to me that with a different telos, a given action will have a different name. So you can call it something completely different. And so it's not necessarily that like, oh, all of these different words that we have for actions that a person can make, those are inherently neutral. It's like, that like, for example, like killing someone in self-defense versus like committing murder or something like that. Like we have the different words to kind of denote the different type of, telos.
There's a difference between a surgery and a stabbing, but
Right.
both of them involve putting a blade into somebody.
Exactly. And,
well
I want
differentiated.
Yeah. And I want to quickly indict Ishmael here. I mean, we already know he's guilty, but I just want to do this really quick. So he says in the beginning that he heard this story from Tashtego, and I don't know how well his command of English is, because we know that he's a Native American guy that is also a harpoonman on a ship where everybody's got thick accents and everyone's got a different accent and everything. Saying it in his sleep, pieced together later. The story that he heard it 2 years after it happened. And then he goes at the end, and these people are supposedly asking him about the authenticity, not that, he completely set this up so that he could, justify himself, and he says that it's true in substance and in its great items. I know it to be true. I trod the ship, I knew the crew, and I have seen and talked with Steelkilt since the death of Radney, even though just the previous page, he said no one's seen him since. Or, like no one knows where he is. And it's just like, oh yeah, no one knows where he is. But also I was on the ship, even though this happened 2 years before, and I heard the story afterwards, but I knew the crew. It's just like, what is this entire thing? I'm just kind of wondering, like, and not to, like to negate the good conversation we just had, but I almost wonder if this was all just kind of like, when people like dog owners put like the little bit of medicine in a sandwich, and then like give it to their dog. I wonder if this entire story is just like Moby Dick good, and then it's just the rest is the sandwich,
Yes.
Well, I tell you what, gentlemen, I didn't get lunch today, so I'm thinking about sandwiches just as a matter of course. So, yeah, fascinating chapter. I'm glad we really were able to dive into this chapter 54, even though it made our reading quite a bit longer. And yeah, we're kind of roughly at the halfway point here in 10 episodes. So hopefully we can wrap it up in another 10 episodes, and I could have my Sunday afternoons back.
Us too.
Yes, us too.
Because very often I come right from the Latin Mass here, and I get a little bit tired. But I think it's worth it. I think it's fascinating conversations. And yeah, be good. Attend to the things that you're supposed to do. And hopefully everything works out well and you don't get eaten by a giant whale. So take care.